The autumn night wrapped around the city like a soft blanket, streetlights casting long shadows across empty roads. In her black Mercedes, the newly appointed police chief couldn't stop smiling as she drove through the familiar streets of her precinct. Just hours ago, she had made history, becoming the first black woman to lead the department in its 127-year existence. She had removed her formal uniform after the ceremony, changing into her favorite navy blazer and white blouse, more comfortable for the drive home. Her badge and uniform were carefully hung in the back seat, a symbol of everything she'd worked for over the last 20 years. As she cruised down Madison Avenue, memories flooded back. This was where she'd walked her first beat as a rookie officer, getting to know every shop owner, every street vendor, and every kid who played basketball in the community park. Back then, some of those same shop owners had looked at her with surprise, sometimes even suspicion, when she first showed up in uniform. But she'd won them over, one conversation at a time. The radio played softly in the background as she turned onto Oak Street, passing by Mrs. Chen's corner store where she used to grab coffee during her night shifts. The old lady still kept the store open late, her neon OPN sign a beacon for night owls and night shift workers. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Chen organizing shelves, just like she'd done every night for the past 2 decades. Something caught her eye in the rearview mirror, headlights steady and following. Her police instincts kicked in, noting how the vehicle maintained the same distance for several blocks. Years of experience had taught her to stay alert while keeping calm. She checked her speedometer, exactly at the limit. Her turn signals were working fine. The registration was up to date. There was no reason for concern, yet the vehicle behind her continued to follow. She thought about her speech from earlier that evening. Change doesn't come from big gestures. It comes from small moments, from daily interactions, from being present in the community. The applause had been thunderous, but she knew the real work was just beginning. Her appointment wasn't just about breaking barriers, it was about building bridges. The car was still behind her, and now she could make out the distinct shape of a police cruiser in her mirror. A small smile played on her lips as she realized what might be happening. In plain clothes, driving a nice car, in this neighborhood, she knew exactly what assumptions might be running through their heads. It was the same kind of assumption she'd fought against her entire career. She took a deep breath, remembering her father's words from years ago. Sometimes the best way to teach is to let others learn from their own actions. He'd been right then, and maybe his words would prove right tonight too. The red and blue lights finally flickered to life in her mirror, and she felt a familiar mix of emotions, not fear or anger, but a calm determination. This moment, this interaction about to unfold, could be exactly the kind of small moment she talked about in her speech. As she carefully signaled and pulled over to the curb, she couldn't help but think that sometimes the most powerful lessons come when we least expect them. She turned off her music, rolled down her window slightly, and placed both hands on the steering wheel, following the same procedures she taught countless times at the academy. The night air carried the sound of approaching footsteps, and she prepared herself for what would surely be an interesting encounter. After all, sometimes the best stories aren't the ones we plan, but the ones that find us when we least expect them. The police cruiser parked about 15 feet behind her Mercedes, its bright lights flooding her car's interior. Through her side mirror, she watched as 2 officers stepped out, both young, probably fresh from the academy. They did the standard approach, one on each side of her car, flashlights sweeping across her windows. License and registration. The officer on the driver's side called out, his voice carrying that forced authority that rookie officers often use to mask their nervousness. His flashlight beam moved across her face, then around the car's interior. The leather seats and wood-grain dashboard seemed to catch his attention a bit too long. "Good evening, officer," she replied calmly, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" She knew the routine from both sides. She'd made hundreds of traffic stops herself and had trained countless officers on proper procedure. The slight tremor in the young officer's voice didn't escape her notice. "You were driving suspiciously slow through a high-traffic area," he stated, though they both knew the stretch of road had been practically empty. His partner, on the passenger side, kept his flashlight trained on the back seat, where her uniform hung in clear view, though from their angle, they couldn't make out the chief's insignia. She noticed their badge numbers, mentally noting how the senior officer was breaking protocol by not introducing himself or stating the specific violation. 20 years on the force had taught her to catch these details automatically. Their body cameras were on, the small red lights blinking steadily in the darkness. "I'm going to reach for my documents now," she announced clearly, moving her right hand slowly toward the glove compartment. The tension in their postures was visible. Another rookie mistake. They were too rigid, too uncertain. She'd need to address that in future training sessions. The glove compartment opened with a soft click. Inside, everything was organized perfectly, a habit from years of police work. As she reached for her registration, she could hear them whispering to each other, probably running her plates through dispatch. Her lips curved into a slight smile, knowing what they'd find in a few moments. "Ma'am, could you step out of the vehicle?" the senior officer asked, his hand reflexively moving toward his belt. That was strike 3. There was no valid reason to ask her to exit the vehicle for a simple traffic stop. She made another mental note. The department clearly needed a refresher course on traffic stop protocols. "Of course," she replied, her voice steady and professional. "I'm going to unbuckle my seatbelt now." She moved with deliberate slowness, remembering how she'd trained dozens of officers about the importance of clear communication during stops. The night air was cool as she stepped out, her heels clicking softly on the pavement. She stood tall, briefcase in one hand, her credentials in the other. The officers' flashlights tracked her movement, their beams crossing over her face, then down to her hands. "Officers," she began, her tone carrying the natural authority that had earned her the department's top position. "I think there's something you should see." She held out her credentials, watching as the senior officer's flashlight beam settled on the gold badge and ID card. The change in her demeanor was instant and almost comical. The flashlights dipped immediately, and she could practically hear their jaws drop. The senior officer's face went from confident to pale in record time, while his partner took an involuntary step backward. Oh my," the senior officer stammered, suddenly recognizing not just any police badge, but the chief's badge he'd seen presented at this afternoon's ceremony. The same ceremony he'd watched from the back row, never imagining he'd encounter his new boss like this. The night had suddenly become very interesting indeed, and as she stood there, she couldn't help but think this would be a teaching moment none of them would soon forget. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to touch. Both officers stood frozen, their flashlight beams now pointed at the ground, creating small pools of light on the asphalt. The night air had grown noticeably cooler, or maybe it was just the chill of realization running down their spines. "At ease, officers," the chief said, her voice carrying a gentle authority that broke the tension. "Let's talk about what happened here." She gestured to the side of the road, away from passing traffic. The younger officer looked like he wanted to melt into the shadows, while his senior partner kept opening and closing his mouth, struggling to find words. "Chief, we didn't," the senior officer started, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. His hand shook slightly as he holstered his flashlight. The beam from the cruiser's headlights caught the sweat now beading on his forehead. "First," she interrupted smoothly, "tell me what made you decide to follow my vehicle." Her tone wasn't angry or accusatory. Instead, it carried the same measured curiosity she'd used countless times in training sessions. She leaned slightly against her car, creating a more casual atmosphere. The officers exchanged nervous glances. The younger one finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "The vehicle seemed out of place for this neighborhood, ma'am." He immediately winced at his own words, realizing how they sounded. Out of place, she repeated thoughtfully, letting the words hang in the air. And what exactly makes a vehicle look out of place in this neighborhood? She watched as understanding dawned on their faces, the kind of understanding that couldn't come from any training manual. The dashboard camera in their cruiser continued recording, its small red light blinking steadily. She made a mental note to save this footage for future training sessions. Sometimes the best lessons come from real-life moments like these. "We should have asked for your license first, before," the senior officer began, trying to redirect the conversation to procedural matters. His partner nodded vigorously, grateful for the shift in topic. "Yes, you should have," she agreed. "But let's go back to why you really pulled me over. When you ran my plates, which I know you did, what did dispatch tell you about the vehicle's registration?" She raised an eyebrow, waiting. The younger officer cleared his throat. It came back clean, registered to a resident of this district." He shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. "So what made you continue with the stop?" she pressed, not unkindly. "What made you ask me to step out of the vehicle?" A passing car slowed down to look at the scene. A well-dressed black woman standing confidently before two increasingly uncomfortable police officers. The silence that followed her questions was broken only by the soft hum of the cruiser's engine and the distant sound of city traffic. Both officers stared at their boots, the weight of their assumptions heavy on their shoulders. "Here's what's going to happen," she said finally, straightening up. "Tomorrow morning, both of you will report to my office at 9 a.m. sharp. Bring your body camera footage and a written report of this stop. We're going to use this as a learning opportunity, not just for you, but for the entire department." The relief on their faces was visible. They had expected much worse. But she wasn't finished. "And officers, take a good look around this neighborhood. These are the streets I grew up on. These are the people I served as a beat cop, the same people I'll continue serving as their chief. Every person you stop is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's neighbor. Remember that." She watched as her words sank in, seeing something shift in their expressions. It wasn't just shame or embarrassment now. There was understanding beginning to take root. And maybe that was the most important thing to come out of this night. The chief reached into her briefcase, pulling out a small leather wallet. The gold badge caught the streetlight, gleaming bright enough to make both officers squint. But it wasn't just any badge. It was the same one they'd watched the mayor present during that afternoon's ceremony. "I believe you were both there today," she said, watching recognition dawn in their eyes. "Back row, right side of the auditorium." The younger officer's mouth fell open slightly, while his partner's face turned an impressive shade of red. In the distance, a siren wailed, and somewhere a dog barked at the night. The moment felt suspended in time, like a photograph waiting to be developed. Their cruiser's lights still painted the scene in alternating red and blue, creating an almost theatrical effect. "Chief, we had no idea," the senior officer stammered. His earlier authoritative tone completely vanished. His hand kept moving from his belt to his side, unsure where to rest. "If we had known." "That's exactly the point," she cut in, her voice firm, but not unkind. "You didn't know who I was. And that's what concerns me." She tucked her credentials away, the leather wallet disappearing smoothly into her blazer pocket. "Tell me, how many other people have you stopped tonight?" The officers exchanged nervous glances. The younger one pulled out his notepad, fingers trembling slightly as he flipped through the pages. 3 stops, ma'am," he admitted quietly. "And how many of those stops followed all proper procedures?" she asked, already knowing the answer from their expressions. The notepad disappeared quickly back into his pocket. A car drove past slowly, its occupants craning their necks to look at the unusual scene. Their new police chief standing confidently, while 2 officers seemed to shrink into their uniforms. The chief noticed their audience and knew tomorrow's gossip would spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. "Your body cameras are still running," she reminded them, gesturing to the blinking red lights on their chests. Tomorrow, we're going to review this footage together. But right now, I want you both to do something. She paused, making sure she had their full attention. Look around you. Really look. She gestured to the neighborhood stretching out around them. That store over there? Mrs. Chen's been running it for 30 years. She makes the best coffee in the district. The basketball court 2 blocks down. Kids from the community center practice there every afternoon. The auto shop on the corner. The owner gives free basic repairs to elderly residents. The officers followed her gaze, seeing the neighborhood through new eyes. The same streets they'd been patrolling suddenly felt different, more alive with stories and connections. This isn't just a patrol route, she continued, her voice softening. This is a community. Every person you stop, every car you pull over, there's a story there. A life. A family. When you approached my car tonight, what story did you think you were going to find? The question hung in the air, heavier than the badge in her pocket. The senior officer's shoulders slumped slightly, understanding washing over his face. His partner stared at a fixed point in the distance, processing the weight of their assumptions. Chief, the younger officer finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. What happens now? She smiled, but it wasn't the smile of someone enjoying their discomfort. It was the smile of a teacher seeing a learning moment unfold. Now we turn this into something positive. Tomorrow morning, my office, 9 a.m. sharp. Bring your reports, bring this footage, and most importantly, bring your honesty. We're going to have a real conversation about what it means to protect and serve everyone in this community. The night seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. In the distance, the city skyline glittered, a reminder of the bigger picture beyond this one moment, this one street, this one traffic stop that would change more than just 3 people's perspectives. The red and blue lights from the police cruiser finally switched off, leaving them in the gentle glow of street lamps. The chief motioned for the officers to join her by a nearby bench, creating a more informal setting for what needed to be said. 20 years ago, she began, settling onto the bench, I was standing right where you are now. The officers remained standing, still too nervous to sit. Fresh from the academy, certain I knew everything there was to know about being a good police officer. A gentle breeze rustled through nearby trees, carrying the familiar sounds of the city. Distant traffic, the rumble of the subway, the last calls of street vendors closing up their stands. This was her city, her neighborhood, in all its living, breathing reality. My first week on patrol, I stopped an expensive car in this very neighborhood. She continued, watching understanding dawn in their eyes. The driver was an older black man in a suit. I was so sure I had spotted something suspicious. Want to know who he was? The younger officer nodded, while his partner shifted uncomfortably on his feet. He was the district judge, had been for 15 years. She let out a small laugh, but it carried no bitterness. He could have reported me, could have made things very difficult for a rookie officer. Instead, he took the time to talk to me, really talk to me. That conversation changed my entire approach to policing. A group of late-night workers passed by, heading home from their shifts. They waved at the chief. Many knew her from her years walking these streets. The officers watched these interactions with growing awareness. Look at your hands, she instructed suddenly. Both officers glanced down, confused. Those hands hold a lot of power. The power to protect, yes, but also the power to hurt. The power to help, and the power to harm. Every time you stop someone, you're making a choice about how to use that power. The younger officer's hand moved unconsciously to his badge, touching it as if feeling its weight for the first time. His partner's eyes remained fixed on his own hands, realization dawning on his face. Tell me, she continued, what made you suspicious of my car tonight? Be honest. This isn't about punishment. It's about understanding. The senior officer cleared his throat. It was the model of the car in this neighborhood. The tinted windows, the slow driving. Each reason sounded weaker as he spoke it aloud. And would those same things have made you suspicious in the downtown district? She pressed gently. Or in the suburbs? Their silence was answer enough. Tomorrow, we'll review procedures and protocols, she said, standing up from the bench. But tonight, I want you to think about something else. Think about the stories you tell yourself when you see someone who looks like me driving a nice car. Think about the assumptions you make when you patrol certain neighborhoods. She reached into her pocket and pulled out 2 business cards, handing one to each officer. These are my direct numbers, not because you're in trouble, but because I want you to remember this moment. I want you to call me when you're facing a difficult situation, when you're unsure about a decision. The cards trembled slightly in their hands as they accepted them. The gesture's significance wasn't lost on anyone. The chief of police offering personal mentorship to the very officers who had profiled her. We're not just law enforcement, she said, her voice carrying quiet authority. We're community builders, peacekeepers. Every interaction is a chance to either build trust or break it. Tonight, you learned that lesson the hard way. But tomorrow, we start building something better. She glanced at her watch. Nearly midnight. The city never really slept, but it did slow down, offering moments like this for reflection and growth. Go finish your shift, she said finally, but drive these streets differently now. See the people, not just the patrol route. And remember, every person you stop is someone's chief of something, even if they're not wearing a badge. The officers straightened up, a new understanding visible in their posture. Sometimes the best lessons come wrapped in moments of discomfort, and tonight had been uncomfortable enough to leave a lasting impression. The morning sun streamed through the precinct windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. By 7 a.m., the story had already spread like wildfire through the building. Officers gathered in small groups, their morning coffee forgotten in their hands as they whispered about last night's events. The front desk officer looked up as the chief walked in, her presence commanding attention without effort. The usual morning bustle quieted for a moment, then resumed with a different energy. Eyes followed her path to her office, some curious, others uncomfortable, a few openly admiring. "Morning, Chief," called out the desk sergeant, his voice carrying across the lobby. She nodded in response, noting how he stood a little straighter than usual. The night shift crews were just ending their rotation, passing on their duties to the day shift, and the story had already made its rounds among them too. Inside her office, she found a stack of reports waiting on her desk. On top lay 2 freshly typed accounts of last night's traffic stop, the paper still warm from the printer. Both officers had arrived early to submit their reports, though their 9 a.m. meeting was still hours away. A knock on her door interrupted her reading. "Come in," she called, looking up to find her veteran lieutenant standing there, worry lines creasing his forehead. "Chief, about last night," he began, but she held up a hand. "Close the door," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. As he sat down, she could see the mix of emotions playing across his face. Concern, embarrassment, and something else. Pride, maybe. "Those were my officers," he said finally. "My responsibility. I should have trained them better." Through her office window, she could see more officers arriving for the day shift. The usual morning banter was subdued, replaced by serious conversations and thoughtful faces. Change was already rippling through the precinct. "Actually," she replied, "there are officers, and this is our opportunity." She stood up, walking to the window. "Look out there. Every person in this building is talking about what happened last night. But they're not just talking about 2 officers making a mistake. They're talking about what happens next." The lieutenant joined her at the window, watching as the 2 officers from last night walked into the building. Their usual confident stride was replaced by something more thoughtful, more aware. Other officers nodded to them, not in judgment, but in understanding. Many had their own stories of lessons learned the hard way. "I've got 3 other precincts calling already," the lieutenant said, shaking his head. "Word travels fast in this department." "Good," she replied, turning back to her desk. "Because what happens in this office at 9 a.m. isn't just about last night. It's about every night. Every stop. Every interaction." She picked up the officers' reports, noting how their handwriting betrayed their nervousness. "We're going to use this, not to punish, but to progress. I want every officer in this building to understand that growth doesn't come from being perfect. It comes from being honest about our imperfections." The morning briefing room across the hall was filling up. Through the glass, she could see officers taking their seats, the usual chatter replaced by serious discussions. Someone had already put up a new poster about community relations on the bulletin board. "You know," the lieutenant said, a slight smile crossing his face, "when they appointed you chief, some people wondered if you'd be tough enough for the job. I don't think anyone's wondering that anymore." She laughed softly, remembering all the doubts she'd faced throughout her career. "Tough isn't about showing force," she said, gathering her materials for the upcoming meeting. "It's about having the courage to turn difficult moments into opportunities for change." The clock on her wall showed 8:45 a.m. Soon, 2 nervous officers would walk through her door, expecting the worst, but about to become part of something much bigger than a single traffic stop on a quiet night. 1 month after that fateful traffic stop, the precinct looked different. Not just physically, with its new community bulletin boards and updated training schedules, but in the way officers carried themselves and how they interacted with the public. The chief stood at the back of the training room, watching as the 2 officers from that night led a session on bias awareness. Their voices had grown confident over the past weeks, their experiences transformed into valuable teaching tools. "So there we were," the senior officer was saying, "thinking we were just doing our jobs. But we weren't seeing the whole picture." He clicked to the next slide, showing a nighttime traffic stop scene. "We weren't seeing the person behind the wheel. We were seeing our assumptions." The room was packed. Officers from 3 other precincts had come to attend these new training sessions. Some took notes, others nodded in recognition of their own similar experiences. In the front row, a group of rookie officers sat forward in their chairs, absorbing every word. During the break, the chief overheard conversations in the hallway. "Remember that stop I made last week?" One officer was saying to his partner. "I almost made the same mistake, but then I remembered this training. Changed my whole approach." The younger of the 2 officers who'd stopped her now stood by a chart showing the precinct's latest community feedback scores. The numbers were trending upward, slowly but steadily. "It's not just about avoiding mistakes," he explained to a group of interested officers. "It's about building real connections." In her office, a stack of letters from community members sat on her desk. One caught her eye. It was from Mrs. Chen, the store owner. "Dear Chief," it read, "I've noticed such a difference in how the officers treat everyone. Last night, 2 of them stopped by just to check how I was doing. No suspicion, no tension, just genuine care." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows as she walked through the dispatch center. The radio crackled with the day's calls, but there was a noticeable difference in how officers reported their interactions. "Conducting a community check," one voice said. "Speaking with the local business owners about their concerns." In the break room, officers gathered around a new bulletin board labeled Community Voices. Photos showed recent community events. Officers playing basketball with local kids, attending neighborhood meetings, helping at the food bank. But more importantly, there were stories shared by residents, both positive and critical, helping officers see their impact through the community's eyes. The chief paused by the window, watching a patrol car stop near the community center. The officer stepped out, not with the tense readiness of before, but with an open, approachable demeanor. A group of teenagers waved, and the officer waved back. A simple gesture that would have seemed unlikely just weeks ago. "Chief," Her assistant appeared at the door. The commissioner called. He wants to know if other precincts can implement your new training program. She smiled, remembering that night, how something that could have ended badly had instead sparked real change. The two officers who'd stopped her had become unexpected champions of reform, their mistake transformed into a powerful lesson for others. Later that afternoon, she watched from her office as the shift changed. Officers heading out on patrol carried themselves differently now. They weren't just looking for trouble to stop. They were looking for opportunities to connect, to understand, to serve. On her desk, a new report showed decreased complaints about officer conduct, increased community engagement, and higher officer job satisfaction. But the real changes couldn't be captured in statistics. They were in the small moments, the respectful conversations, the benefit of the doubt given, the assumptions challenged before they could take root. The precinct had become a model for what community policing could be. Not perfect, but progressing. Not flawless, but learning. And most importantly, not just enforcing the law, but building the trust that made real justice possible. The community center buzzed with activity as residents filed in for the monthly town hall meeting. Usually, these meetings drew maybe 20 people. Tonight, every chair was filled, with people standing along the walls. The story of that traffic stop had spread through the neighborhood, transforming from a potential flashpoint into a catalyst for change. The chief stood at the back, watching as one of the officers from that night finished setting up the presentation screen. 3 months had passed, and so much had changed. A local news crew set up their cameras. They'd been following the precinct's transformation with growing interest. "I never thought I'd say this," an elderly resident was saying to her neighbor, "but I actually feel comfortable when I see police cars in our neighborhood now. They're not just driving through, they're part of the community." The room quieted as the town hall began. The first speaker was a local shop owner, his voice carrying clearly across the packed room. "Last month, my store was having trouble with some kids hanging around late at night. Instead of just chasing them away, the officers talked to them. Found out they needed a safe place to study after school. Now the community center stays open later, and those kids, they're doing better in school." A teenager stood up next, his basketball tucked under his arm. "The officers play ball with us now," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "They're not bad at it either. Well, most of them." Laughter rippled through the crowd, including from the officers present. The chief watched as hands went up across the room, not with complaints, but with stories. A mother told how an officer helped her son with his homework while waiting for a tow truck. A business owner described how the regular police visits had made his late-night employees feel safer. But it wasn't all praise. Some residents spoke about past hurts, about trust still being rebuilt. The difference was in how these concerns were received. Officers listened with genuine attention, taking notes, asking questions about how to do better. "I've lived here 40 years, an older man said, standing slowly with his cane. "I used to tell my grandkids to be careful around the police. Now, I tell them the police are here to help. That's a big change." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The local reporter jotted notes furiously as more people shared their experiences. The precinct's story was spreading beyond the neighborhood now, catching attention across the city. Other precincts were sending officers to observe, to learn. Near the refreshment table, the two officers from that famous traffic stop chatted with residents, their earlier nervousness replaced by genuine engagement. They'd become symbols of change, proof that mistakes could lead to growth. A young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, pointing at the chief. "Is that really her? From the story?" The chief smiled, remembering how that night could have gone so differently. Instead of hiding that incident, they turned it into a teaching moment that rippled through the entire community. The town hall stretched past its scheduled end time, but nobody seemed to mind. People lingered, talking in small groups, sharing phone numbers, making plans for community projects. Officers and residents stood side by side, the barriers between them dissolving. Outside, The street had transformed too. Where once people hurried past police cars with heads down, now they waved, stopped to chat. The night patrol cars moved slower through the neighborhood, officers knowing not just the streets, but the stories of the people who lived there. As the meeting finally wound down, the chief overheard a conversation between two residents. "You know what's different?" one was saying. "It's not us versus them anymore. We're all just people trying to make our community better." That, she thought, was the real victory. Not in statistics or news stories, but in these small moments of connection, of understanding. The night of that traffic stop hadn't just changed two officers. It had started a wave of change that was still growing, still touching lives, still bringing people together. 6 months had passed since that moonlit traffic stop. The chief sat in her office, reviewing the latest department statistics. But the real changes couldn't be captured in numbers alone. They were written in the stories that echoed through the precinct halls. The two officers who'd stopped her that night were now leading the morning briefing. Through the glass walls of the meeting room, she could see them sharing their experiences with a new batch of recruits. Their story had become a powerful teaching tool, not just in their precinct, but across the entire city. "Remember," the senior officer was saying, "every person you meet has a story. The mistake isn't in making assumptions. It's in letting those assumptions guide your actions." The rookies leaned forward, absorbing every word from officers who've learned this lesson firsthand. Outside, the neighborhood had transformed. Store owners kept their shops open later, feeling safer with the new community policing approach. Kids played basketball until dusk, waving at passing patrol cars. Even Mrs. Chen's corner store had become an unofficial meeting spot where officers and residents chatted over coffee. The chief picked up a letter from her desk, one of many that had poured in over the months. This one was from a young officer in another city. "Your precinct's story changed how I approach my job. Last week, I caught myself making the same assumptions. But then I remembered your lesson, and I handled things differently." A knock at her door interrupted her reading. The two officers from that night entered, carrying fresh statistics. "Chief," the younger one said, pride evident in his voice, "complaints are down 70% since we started the new training program." "But that's not the best part." She raised an eyebrow, waiting. "Community engagement is up 300%, the senior officer continued. "People are coming to us before problems start. They trust us to help, not just enforce." Through her window, she watched a patrol car stop at the community center. The officer stepped out, high-fiving some kids before checking in with the center staff. This wasn't just policing. It was community building. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as she walked through the precinct. Officers greeted her with genuine respect, not just because of her rank, but because of how she'd handled that night. She'd turned what could have been a moment of punishment into an opportunity for growth. In the break room, a new officer was sharing his experience with colleagues. "Yesterday, I stopped this expensive car in our neighborhood." But before jumping to conclusions, I remembered the chief's story. Turned out to be a local success story. Guy grew up here, made it big, came back to mentor kids. The chief smiled, remembering her own mentor from years ago. That traffic stop where she pulled over a judge had shaped her career. Now, her story was shaping others. Later that evening, she drove the same route where it all happened. The street looked different now. Not because it had changed, but because the way they policed it had changed. Every corner held a story, every resident a connection. As she passed Mrs. Chen's store, she saw one of the officers from that night inside, having coffee with local residents. They were laughing, sharing stories, building the kind of trust that made communities safer than any number of patrol cars could. The sun was setting as she parked near the precinct. A group of officers was finishing their shift, talking with neighborhood kids about an upcoming community basketball tournament. This was what real change looked like, not in grand gestures, but in these small, daily moments of connection. 6 months ago, a traffic stop could have deepened the divide between policed and community. Instead, it had bridged it. The lesson wasn't just about avoiding mistakes. It was about turning moments of potential conflict into opportunities for understanding. As she walked into the precinct, the chief knew that while their transformation wasn't perfect, it was real. And sometimes, real change starts with one traffic stop, one moment of honesty, and the courage to learn from it.